The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge took his seat. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made everyone sit a little straighter, hold their breath a little longer. At the center of it all sat a little girl, no more than 8 years old, her small hands gripping the wooden bench as if holding on for dear life. Her eyes, big and round, darted between the stern-faced judge and the towering figure of the man standing at the defendant's table. Beside her, a golden retriever sat patiently. His ears perked up, his body unusually still. No one knew just how important that dog was. Not yet. The case had already drawn attention. A well-known businessman, accused of something serious, was standing trial. But what made this case different wasn't just the evidence, or lack of it. It was the child. She was the only witness. And now, as she sat there, swinging her legs slightly, the entire courtroom seemed to be waiting for what she would say. Her guardian, a woman in her 40s, placed a reassuring hand on her back. "Just tell the truth, sweetie," she whispered. The girl nodded, but her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her dress. Across the room, the businessman's lawyer smirked. He knew how these things went. A child on the stand. Unreliable. Easily confused. Emotional. He had already planned how to twist her words, how to make the jury doubt her. The judge cleared his throat. "Are you ready, young lady?" The girl swallowed hard. Then, for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. "Yes, sir." The prosecutor stepped forward. "Can you tell us what happened that night?" She hesitated. Just for a second. Her fingers curled tighter around the sleeve of her dress. And then, as if sensing her hesitation, the golden retriever beside her made the smallest movement. A nudge against her leg. A reminder that she wasn't alone. She took a deep breath. "I was in my room," she started. "I heard voices. Loud ones." The courtroom leaned in. "Did you recognize them?" the prosecutor asked. She nodded. "One of them was him." She pointed, a tiny finger aimed directly at the businessman. The room held its breath. The businessman's lawyer stood. "Objection. She's just a child." "Overruled," the judge said. "Continue." The little girl swallowed again. Her hands were shaking now. The businessman's eyes locked onto hers, cold and unreadable. And then, just when it seemed like she might not say another word, she did something no one expected. She glanced down at her dog. And then, so quick that most people wouldn't have noticed, she made a tiny, almost invisible hand signal. Just a flick of her fingers. The dog's ears twitched. His posture changed. And before anyone could react, he let out a low, sharp bark. The judge's gavel slammed down. Order in the court. But the damage had been done. The room erupted into chaos. Lawyers scrambled, whispers turned into full-blown conversations, and the businessman, so confident just moments ago, looked pale for the first time. The judge turned to the little girl. His voice firm but puzzled. "What was that? What did you just do?" And then, for the first time since she walked into that courtroom, the little girl smiled. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there, because she knew something no one else did. Her dog wasn't just a pet. He was trained to recognize a lie. And he had just revealed the biggest one in that courtroom. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. All eyes were now on the little girl and her dog. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Young lady," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need you to explain what just happened." The girl's fingers tightened around the soft fur of her golden retriever. Her small chest rose and fell with deep breaths as she looked up at the judge. The prosecutor exchanged glances with his assistant, clearly just as surprised as everyone else. The businessman's lawyer stood again, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It's just a dog reacting to the atmosphere in the room. That means nothing." The judge ignored him, keeping his eyes on the girl. "Did you signal the dog on purpose?" She hesitated, as if debating whether to say the truth. Then she nodded. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The businessman's lawyer scoffed. So what? What exactly are we supposed to take from that? He turned to the judge. Your Honor, we're in a courtroom, not a circus. This child can't just. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. Then he turned back to the girl. Tell me why you signaled him. She shifted slightly in her seat. Because he knows, she said softly. The lawyer let out a sharp breath, clearly annoyed. Knows what? The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at her dog again, as if checking for reassurance. The golden retriever remained still, his amber eyes watching her closely. Finally she spoke. He knows when people aren't telling the truth. The words sent another wave of murmurs through the courtroom. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly, but his face remained composed. Are you saying your dog can tell when someone is lying? The little girl nodded. He was trained for it. The businessman's lawyer let out a laugh. Trained for it. Your Honor, this is absurd. It's ridiculous. We're wasting time. The prosecutor leaned forward now. His interest clearly piqued. Let her explain, he said. The judge nodded. Go on, young lady. She took another deep breath. My uncle trains service dogs, she said, her voice quiet but steady. Some of them help people who can't see. Some of them help people who are sick. She reached down and scratched behind the golden retriever's ear. And some of them can tell when people are lying. They can pick up on things people don't notice, like little changes in how someone moves or how their voice sounds. The prosecutor stepped closer. And this dog, your dog, he was trained for that? She nodded again. He's not just my dog. He belonged to my uncle first. I've been helping take care of him for a long time. The judge folded his hands in front of him. And what exactly did your signal mean? The girl's fingers curled into the dog's fur. She hesitated again, then spoke. It means, listen carefully. The prosecutor's expression grew more serious. And when you signaled him just now, what happened? The little girl's voice was barely above a whisper. He heard a lie. A hush fell over the room. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His lawyer scoffed again, but this time there was a slight edge to his voice. Your Honor, we cannot seriously entertain the idea that a child's pet can determine guilt in a courtroom. The prosecutor ignored him. He turned back to the girl. Can you tell us when your dog reacts to a lie? She nodded. He gives little signs. Sometimes he twitches his ears. Sometimes his breathing changes. If he's sure, he barks. The prosecutor's expression remained thoughtful. Has he ever been wrong? The little girl shook her head. Not when he's trained to listen. The businessman finally spoke up, his voice cold. This is nonsense. You're all letting a child and her dog play games in a courtroom. His lips curled into a thin smile. People lie all the time. Even kids. His eyes locked onto hers. Maybe she's lying right now. The girl didn't flinch, but her grip on her dog tightened. For the first time, the golden retriever let out a quiet, low growl. The sound was barely noticeable, but those who heard it shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge sighed. This is highly unusual, he admitted. Then he looked at the prosecutor. Do you have any way to verify her claims? The prosecutor thought for a moment. Then he nodded. We can conduct a small test if the court allows. The businessman's lawyer groaned. Oh, come on. But the judge was intrigued. Proceed. The prosecutor turned to the girl. Can we try something? Just to see how your dog reacts. She nodded hesitantly. Okay, he said, then turned to one of his assistants. Bring me a notepad. The assistant quickly handed him a small notepad and a pen. The prosecutor scribbled something down, tore off the sheet, and handed it to the judge. The judge read it, then nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Then the prosecutor turned to the girl. I'm going to make 2 statements. One will be true and one will be false. I want you to signal your dog the same way you did before, and let's see what happens. Is that okay? She glanced at her dog, then back at the prosecutor. Okay. The courtroom was completely still now. The prosecutor took a deep breath. My name is Michael Davis. The girl made the same small hand signal. The golden retriever remained still. No reaction. The prosecutor nodded slightly, then continued. I was born in New York City. Again the girl gave the signal. This time the golden retriever shifted slightly. His ears twitched. His breathing changed. And then he let out a sharp bark. The courtroom gasped. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Davis, were you born in New York City? The prosecutor shook his head, smiling faintly. No, Your Honor. I was born in Chicago. Another wave of murmurs spread through the room. The businessman's lawyer looked pale now, but he forced a smirk. That proves nothing. Just coincidence. The prosecutor turned back to the girl. His tone was calm, but there was a new intensity in his eyes. Do you think you could do that again? The little girl hesitated, then nodded. The prosecutor's eyes moved toward the businessman. His smile faded. His voice was steady as he said, Mr. Reynolds never entered your home that night. The girl's small hand moved again. The dog barked, louder this time. The businessman's face turned rigid. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor stepped back, his heart pounding. The judge's voice cut through the air. Order in the court. The tension in the room was unbearable. The businessman's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists. The little girl looked down at her dog and gave him another reassuring pat. The golden retriever, now silent again, remained perfectly still. Because he knew the truth. And so did she. The businessman's face remained emotionless, but something in his eyes had changed. It was quick, just a flicker of something dark, something unsettled. His lawyer leaned in and whispered something, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just stared straight ahead, jaw tight, fingers drumming lightly against the table. The little girl could feel the weight of all the eyes on her. Some of them were filled with doubt, others curiosity, and some, she didn't want to think about those. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She knew what she had seen that night. She knew what she had heard. And more than anything, she knew what her dog had just confirmed. The prosecutor adjusted his tie and took a step forward. Mr. Reynolds, he said, addressing the businessman directly, you've maintained that you were nowhere near the child's home that night. You've claimed that the accusations against you are based on misunderstandings, false assumptions. He gestured toward the little girl and her dog. But so far, your story doesn't seem to hold up very well, does it? The businessman leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. His expression was cool, controlled. Are you seriously basing this case on a dog's reaction? He asked. His voice laced with amusement. A dog that belongs to a little girl who was already coached to believe I did something wrong. The prosecutor didn't flinch. It's not just the dog. It's the inconsistencies in your statements. It's the details that don't add up. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess. There are some matters I'd like to. Before he could finish, the businessman's lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, we object to this entire line of questioning. This trial is supposed to be about facts, not theatrics. He turned toward the jury, his hands spread wide. Are we really going to let a child's pet dictate the course of this case? If this is where we're headed, we might as well bring in a parrot to testify next. A few quiet chuckles spread through the room, but they died quickly under the weight of the tension. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. Mr. Lawson, he said to the businessman's lawyer, while I understand your frustration, I also understand that this situation is highly unusual. However, it is not without merit. The child is a witness, and if her dog's training can be supported with additional evidence, then we cannot simply dismiss it. The lawyer clenched his jaw, but he forced a tight smile. Understood, Your Honor. The judge nodded, then turned toward the prosecutor. I will allow a brief recess. Use your time wisely, Mr. Davis. The gavel struck, and the courtroom slowly began to stir. People whispered to one another, some glancing at the little girl, others at the businessman, who remained motionless in his chair. As the little girl stood, her dog stood with her, pressing against her leg. She reached down and stroked his head. He wasn't just her protector now. He was her proof. Outside the courtroom, the prosecutor knelt in front of her. His voice softer now. "You're doing great," he said. "I know this isn't easy." She nodded but didn't say anything. The prosecutor hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up at him. "Has your dog ever reacted like that before? In other situations?" She thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Once." The prosecutor frowned. "When?" The girl bit her lip, her fingers tightening in her dog's fur. "A long time ago," she said. "Before my uncle gave him to me." The prosecutor exchanged glances with his assistant. "Do you remember the details?" She nodded again. "There was another man. My uncle was talking to him about training dogs. The man said he had worked with animals before." Her voice dropped slightly. "But he was lying." The prosecutor leaned in. "How do you know?" The girl glanced at her dog. "Because he barked. Just like today." The assistant took a slow breath. "And what happened to that man?" The girl hesitated. "My uncle told him to leave. He said he couldn't trust someone who lied about something like that." The prosecutor exhaled, rubbing his chin. "That's interesting." The assistant nodded. "It means the dog has been right before." The little girl looked up at them. "He's always right," she whispered. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse hallway, the businessman and his lawyer stood near a corner, speaking in hushed tones. The lawyer's expression was tense, his fingers gripping the edge of his briefcase. "This is a problem," he muttered. The businessman's jaw clenched. "It's a dog." The lawyer shook his head. "It's not just the dog. It's the way people are looking at you now. They're doubting you." He exhaled sharply. "You need to stick to your story. No hesitation. No slip-ups." The businessman's eyes darkened. "I know what I'm doing." The lawyer studied him for a long moment. "Do you?" A beat of silence stretched between them. Finally, the businessman turned away, adjusting his cufflinks. "This case was never supposed to make it this far," he murmured. The lawyer's eyes flickered with something cautious. "What do you mean?" The businessman didn't answer. Instead, he walked back toward the courtroom doors, his posture stiff, his movements calculated. Inside, the jury members were whispering amongst themselves. A few of them stole glances at the little girl and her dog. And at that moment the businessman knew. Something had shifted. The control he thought he had, it was slipping. The little girl sat back in her chair, her hands resting on her dog's back. She wasn't sure what would happen next. But she did know one thing. She wasn't the only one who could sense the truth now. And that was dangerous. The courtroom doors creaked open as the judge returned to his seat, his expression unreadable. The murmur of voices faded as people settled back into their chairs, anticipation thick in the air. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. The little girl sat quietly, her small hand resting on her dog's back. He remained still, his ears alert, his body tense. The businessman and his lawyer whispered one last time before turning their full attention to the front of the courtroom. There was something different in the businessman's posture now, something stiff, guarded. His usual air of confidence seemed thinner, more fragile. He knew eyes were on him. He could feel it. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Davis, you may proceed." The prosecutor stood, his expression calm but firm. He turned toward the little girl. "I know this has been a long day for you," he said gently. "But I need to ask you something important." She nodded. He hesitated, then spoke. "Before today, did you ever see Mr. Reynolds in person?" She looked toward the businessman, her eyes searching his face. Then slowly she shook her head. No. The businessman's lawyer smirked, leaning back in his chair. Well, that's convenient. The prosecutor ignored him. But have you heard his voice before? The little girl hesitated, her small fingers curling into the fur of her dog. Her heartbeat quickened as she remembered that night. The shadows, the hushed voices, the sound of the door creaking. Yes, she whispered. The businessman's fingers tightened against the table. His lawyer's smirk disappeared. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly. Where? The girl's lips parted, but the words felt stuck in her throat. She didn't want to remember, but she had to. She took a slow breath. That night, she said softly. In the house. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The businessman's lawyer immediately shot to his feet. Objection. This is pure speculation. She's a child listening to sounds in the dark. She could have misheard anything. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Davis. The prosecutor turned back to the girl. You're sure? She nodded, her voice stronger this time. I heard him talking. The businessman's face remained still, but his knuckles had turned white. The prosecutor walked slowly toward her. What did he say? The girl swallowed. She could still hear the voice in her mind, low and tense. She didn't understand everything he had said that night, but she remembered the words. She took another breath. He said, "Make sure there's nothing left behind." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The businessman's lawyer's face darkened. This is outrageous. The prosecutor ignored him. And you recognized the voice today? She nodded. Yes. The businessman finally spoke, his voice tight. This is ridiculous. A scared child in the dark thinks she heard something. That's not evidence. He turned toward the judge, his voice sharpening. We can't let this nonsense continue. The prosecutor turned to the jury. His expression calm but serious. This isn't just about what she remembers. It's about how her dog reacted. You all saw it. He wasn't reacting to fear or confusion. He was reacting to the truth. The businessman's jaw tightened. The judge exhaled, glancing between them. Where's the supporting evidence? The prosecutor hesitated, then signaled to his assistant, who quickly passed him a file. He opened it, flipping through pages before pulling out a document. This, he said, holding it up, is the record of Mr. Reynolds's phone location data on the night of the incident. The businessman's lawyer straightened, eyes narrowing. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. Mr. Reynolds has claimed repeatedly that he was nowhere near the area that night, that he was at his office working late. But according to these records, he paused, then placed the paper down on the evidence table. He was less than a mile away. A gasp spread through the room. The businessman's face remained still, but his lawyer quickly whispered something in his ear. The businessman didn't respond. The prosecutor stepped closer. You weren't at your office, were you, Mr. Reynolds? The businessman's hands curled into fists. I was. The prosecutor picked up another document. Then how do you explain this security footage? Another murmur moved through the room as a screen was wheeled in. The assistant pressed a button, and grainy footage played. A figure walking toward a car. The timestamp matched the night of the incident. The prosecutor pointed. This is Mr. Reynolds's vehicle, parked near the girl's neighborhood. The businessman's lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is circumstantial at best. There is no direct proof of any wrongdoing. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Do you have anything more? The prosecutor hesitated. He glanced at the little girl. She was still holding onto her dog, her small frame straight, her eyes unwavering. Then he turned to the businessman. I think we've already seen enough. The businessman didn't move. He sat still, staring straight ahead, his fingers pressed together. His silence stretched longer than it should have. The tension in the room was unbearable now. People held their breath, waiting. And then, The golden retriever let out a single, sharp bark. The businessman flinched. The room erupted into whispers. The prosecutor took a step closer. "Something to say, Mr. Reynolds." The businessman's eyes flickered toward the jury, then toward the girl, then finally at the judge. For the first time there was something in his expression, something close to fear. And then, he stood, slowly, deliberately. The entire courtroom went silent again. His lawyer whispered frantically, but he didn't seem to hear. Instead, he looked directly at the little girl. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "This is a mistake." But this time no one believed him. Not even himself. The golden retriever remained still, watching, waiting, because the truth was about to come out. And everyone knew it. The courtroom was thick with silence. The businessman's words hung in the air, echoing in the minds of everyone present. His lawyer was still whispering furiously, but he didn't seem to be listening. His gaze remained locked onto the little girl, as if searching for something, an answer, an escape, anything that could undo what was unfolding before him. The golden retriever let out another low growl, a deep rumble from his chest. The sound was barely audible, but it sent chills through the room. The girl tightened her grip on his fur. She could feel it, her dog was sensing something. Something still hidden. The prosecutor was the first to break the silence. "Mr. Reynolds, you say this is a mistake." His voice was even, but there was an edge to it. "But what exactly do you mean by that?" The businessman swallowed, a small flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face before his expression hardened again. "I mean, this entire case is built on speculation," he said. His voice was steadier now, more controlled. "You're trying to paint me as a villain because a dog barked. Because a child misheard a voice in the dark." The prosecutor didn't flinch. "Then why do you look nervous?" The businessman let out a short, forced laugh. "Because my entire life is being put on trial over nothing." The prosecutor didn't take his eyes off him. "You know that's not true." The room was suffocating with tension. Every juror, every spectator, even the judge was watching closely, waiting. And then, something unexpected happened. The little girl's dog stopped growling. His body remained tense, his ears still alert, but the growl disappeared. His head tilted slightly, his nose twitching as if he was sniffing something in the air. The girl noticed it first. She looked down at her dog, confused. And then she felt it. A shiver ran down her spine, but not from fear. From realization. Her dog wasn't reacting to the businessman anymore. He was reacting to someone else. Slowly, her eyes scanned the room. The jury, the spectators, the officers standing by the doors. And then she saw him. A man sitting in the farthest row of the courtroom. She hadn't noticed him before. Maybe no one had. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture stiff, his eyes unreadable. But there was something off about him. Something wrong. Her dog took a step forward, his body still tense. The businessman noticed it too. His gaze flickered toward the man in the back, and for the first time, his composure cracked. It was barely visible, a tightening of his jaw, a quick glance away, but the girl caught it. And so did the prosecutor. He followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. He turned back to the businessman, watching him closely. "Mr. Reynolds," he said slowly. "Who is that?" The businessman hesitated, but it was too late. The moment of hesitation was all they needed. The prosecutor nodded toward the bailiffs. "Bring him forward." The man in the back remained still for a second, as if deciding whether to cooperate. Then, with slow and measured movements, he rose from his seat. As he walked forward, the tension in the room shifted. It was no longer centered on the businessman. Now, all eyes were on this new figure, the man no one had paid attention to until now. The girl's dog let out another low growl. Not a bark this time, just a warning. The man stopped just a few feet away from the businessman. His hands clasped together. "I don't see why I'm being called up here," he said, his voice calm. "To come." The prosecutor studied him. Who are you? The man's lips curled into a tight smile. James Keller. I work with Mr. Reynolds. The prosecutor's expression didn't change. In what capacity? Business operations. The businessman had gone completely still. The prosecutor turned toward him. Mr. Reynolds, do you have anything to say about that? For the first time since the trial began, the businessman didn't answer. He just stared ahead, his fingers twitching slightly against the table. And then, before anyone could react, the little girl spoke. He was there that night, she said. A cold wave swept over the courtroom. Keller turned his head slightly, looking at the girl for the first time. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. You must be mistaken, he said smoothly. The girl shook her head. I heard you. The businessman's breathing had become shallow, his face paler than before. The prosecutor took a step forward. Mr. Keller, he said, his voice firm. Where were you on the night of the incident? Keller didn't blink. I was at home. The prosecutor tilted his head slightly. Can anyone confirm that? The businessman exhaled sharply, shaking his head. The prosecutor's eyes snapped to him. What was that? The businessman looked down at the table, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't at home, he muttered. Keller's head turned sharply. Excuse me. The businessman inhaled deeply, then exhaled. And when he finally looked up, his eyes were different. There was no longer arrogance in them, no longer control. There was something else. Resignation. I didn't do it, he said suddenly, his voice hoarse. But I know who did. Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor's heart pounded. Who? The businessman turned toward Keller. And for the first time, the tension in the room shattered like glass. Because the real danger, the real secret, had never been about the businessman. It had been sitting in the back row the whole time. And now it was about to be exposed. The golden retriever let out a single bark. Final warning. And then chaos erupted. The room exploded into chaos. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as people turned to stare at James Keller, the man who had been invisible until now. The businessman, Mr. Reynolds, sat motionless, his gaze fixed on Keller as if a weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The prosecutor was the only one who remained completely still. His eyes locked on Keller, waiting. Keller didn't flinch, didn't react. But there was something cold in his expression now, something calculating. His fingers twitched, and for a second, it seemed like he was about to speak. But then he simply exhaled and looked away. You have nothing, he said quietly. The prosecutor didn't blink. Mr. Reynolds just placed you at the scene that night. Keller gave a small shrug, his face unreadable. A desperate man throwing out accusations to save himself? That's hardly proof. But something had shifted in the air. The businessman wasn't fighting back anymore. He was tired, drained, but most of all, he was done protecting secrets. You were there, the businessman said, his voice low. You said it would be quick. That there wouldn't be any complications. His fingers gripped the edge of the table. But there was a complication, wasn't there? Keller's jaw tightened, his polished calm starting to crack. The little girl's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't understand all the business talk, but she understood what her dog had known from the start. This man, Keller, he wasn't safe. The prosecutor took a slow step forward. Mr. Reynolds, you say you didn't do it. But you know who did. Tell us what happened that night. Reynolds hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Keller, but then he exhaled. We were supposed to clear out a house. His voice was hoarse, as if each word was draining him. An investment deal. There was a problem with some old contracts. I was told it had already been handled, that the house was supposed to be empty. His gaze fell to the little girl. But it wasn't. A heavy silence filled the room. Keller's hands curled into fists, but he didn't say a word. The prosecutor's voice remained steady. And then what happened? Reynolds swallowed hard. I wasn't there when it happened. But I know what I heard later. I know the calls he made, the things he said. His voice wavered. He didn't expect anyone to be inside. When he realized the house wasn't empty, he panicked. The prosecutor turned back to Keller. Is that true? Keller's lips pressed into a thin line. His mask of control was slipping, but he was still fighting to hold on to it. This is ridiculous, he muttered. The golden retriever barked. Loud. Keller flinched. The reaction was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. And in that moment everyone saw it. Keller turned, his eyes locking onto the dog. For the first time, something like real fear flickered across his face. The prosecutor noticed. He knows you, doesn't he? His voice was quieter now, but more dangerous. This dog doesn't react to just anyone. Keller shook his head, but the dog growled again. A deep, low warning that sent chills through the room. The girl looked at Keller now, her small hand still holding onto her dog. And then, in the quietest voice, she whispered, I remember your voice. Keller inhaled sharply. That was it. The moment his entire facade collapsed. His shoulders tensed, his breath came quicker, and for the first time, the room saw him for what he really was. Not a calm, collected businessman, but a man who had just lost control of everything. And then, as if realizing it himself, Keller turned, fast, too fast. His body twisted as if he were about to bolt for the doors. But he never got the chance. A bailiff was on him in seconds, blocking his path. Keller staggered back, his hands raising slightly. This is insane, he snapped. You have no proof. The prosecutor cut him off. We have enough. His voice was like steel now. And I think we'll find more once we start digging deeper. Keller's lips parted, but no words came out. He looked around the room as if searching for a way out, but there was none. The golden retriever let out one final bark. Sound of certainty. And Keller's shoulders finally slumped. It was over. The judge's gavel came down, echoing through the silent room. Officers moved in, placing Keller in handcuffs. The businessman sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the table, his face pale. The little girl felt her breath catch in her chest. She reached out, running her fingers through her dog's fur. And for the first time since this all began, she felt safe. The prosecutor turned to the jury. You've heard the truth today, he said. Now, justice can finally be served. Keller was led away, his face unreadable, but everyone in the courtroom knew. It wasn't just a trial that had ended today. It was a secret that had finally been uncovered. The businessman exhaled shakily, his hands trembling. He wasn't innocent, but he had been part of something he never fully understood. Now he would have to answer for his role in it. But the little girl, she was finally free. As she stood to leave, her dog wagged his tail, his job done. And just as they stepped toward the exit, she paused, looked back one last time, and whispered, "Good boy." The retriever let out a soft huff, nudging her hand. And together they walked out into the light. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, freer. The little girl took a deep breath as she stepped out into the open, her golden retriever walking faithfully by her side. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel afraid. Her mother was waiting for her just outside, tears in her eyes as she rushed forward and pulled her into a tight embrace. "You were so brave," she whispered, holding her close. "I'm so proud of you." The little girl squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the safety of her mother's arms. She had been scared, more scared than she had ever been, but she wasn't alone. Her dog had been there. He had understood even when no one else had. And in the end, the truth had come out. The prosecutor stepped outside a moment later, his expression softer than before. He knelt down to meet the girl's eyes. "You did something very important today," he told her. "Because of you, justice was served." The girl hesitated, glancing down at her dog. I think he did most of the work, she said quietly. The prosecutor smiled. I think you both did. The golden retriever wagged his tail, as if he understood. Not far from them, Mr. Reynolds stood near the courthouse steps. His shoulders slumped as he stared at the ground. He was no longer the confident businessman he had once been. His role in everything wasn't forgotten, and he still had to face the consequences of his choices. But in the end he had spoken the truth. He had let go of the lie that had held him prisoner for so long. The little girl watched him for a moment. She didn't know what would happen to him next. Maybe he would change. Maybe he wouldn't. But that wasn't for her to worry about anymore. As she and her mother began walking toward their car, a group of reporters gathered near the entrance, their voices blending together in a flurry of questions and camera flashes. People wanted to know more. They wanted details. But the girl didn't want to talk about it anymore. She had already said everything she needed to say. She climbed into the back seat, her golden retriever hopping in beside her. As the car pulled away, she stared out the window, watching the courthouse fade into the distance. For a long moment she was quiet. Then she turned to her dog and whispered, "How did you know?" The retriever looked at her. His big brown eyes filled with warmth and understanding. He couldn't answer her, not in words. But he didn't have to. She smiled, scratching behind his ears. "I guess you just did." The drive home was peaceful, the tension that had followed them for weeks finally starting to disappear. When they arrived, the little girl ran inside, her dog trotting close behind. Felt good to be home, to be somewhere safe. That night, she curled up in bed, her golden retriever lying beside her as always. She traced her fingers through his soft fur, feeling comfort in his presence. He had always been there, always protecting her. And now, because of him, everything had changed. She closed her eyes, finally letting herself rest. And for the first time in a long, long time, she slept without fear.